A 17-year-old boy had his hand around a 14-year-old girl's throat. 30 students filmed it. Nobody moved. Then the school doors opened, and a German shepherd walked in like he already knew exactly where to go. Subscribe. You need to see what happened next. There are 3 words that can stop a man cold. Not a warning shot. Not an enemy's voice in the dark. 3 words, typed by a 14-year-old girl on a cracked phone screen sent at 2:17 on a Tuesday afternoon in May. Asterisk Dad. Please. Now. Asterisk. Nathan Reeves. Read them once. Standing in the basement of the Harlow County Municipal Building, where he was replacing a corroded sensor panel on a decade-old security system. He read them once, and then he was already moving. He didn't call back. He didn't text. He whistled once, low and sharp, and Echo was on his feet before the sound faded. Collar clinking, amber eyes locked on Nathan's face, the way they always were when the register of his voice changed, and it had changed. Even the dog knew it. Nathan grabbed his keys off the utility cart, told his supervisor times, family emergency times, in the flattest voice the man had ever heard, and walked out of the building into the pale Ohio afternoon without looking back. He drove the 11 minutes to Maplewood High School in 7. He didn't speed recklessly. He drove the way he'd been trained to move through dangerous terrain with total precision and zero hesitation. Echo rode in the back seat with his nose lifted slightly, reading the air through the cracked window, and when Nathan pulled into the school's front lot and cut the engine, the dog was already still in a way that meant he was ready. Nathan clipped the leash, opened the door, and they went in together. The front hallway of Maplewood High smelled like floor wax and adolescence, and something underneath both of those things, something sharp and animal, that Nathan recognized before his eyes caught up. He pushed through the glass door into the front office, held up his ID to the aide behind the desk and said 2 words, "My daughter." Something in his face or his voice or the dog at his heel made the woman reach for the door release without asking him to sign in. The hallway beyond opened up, and the crowd of students parted without him, asking them to the way water parts around something that doesn't slow down. He heard laughter first. Then he saw his daughter. Caitlin was pressed against the grey metal lockers, with one hand gripping the strap of her backpack, though the backpack was already on the floor, 3 feet away, and her face was the colour of a plum. Tyler Grantham had his right hand wrapped around her throat. He was 17 years old, 6 feet tall, wearing a lacrosse jersey with his last name across the back, and he had the relaxed expression of someone who had never once in his life been told that what he was doing was wrong. Around him, 30 students held up their phones. Someone near the back wall laughed at something someone else said. Nobody moved. A teacher had appeared at the far end of the corridor 3 minutes earlier, had looked at the crowd, had looked at Tyler's jersey, and had turned and walked back the way she came. Echo moved first. Nathan hadn't given a command. He hadn't even shifted his weight. But Echo pulled left without warning, slipping through a gap between 2 sophomore boys, looping wide behind Tyler's position along the far wall of lockers. Moving low and fast and utterly silent, cutting off the only exit route before Tyler registered anything had changed. Nathan kept walking straight. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was never loud when it mattered. "Let go of my daughter." Tyler looked up. Genuine confusion crossed his face, the face of a boy who had genuinely never considered the possibility that something like this moment could exist. His eyes tracked Nathan's frame, the dog tag still hanging outside his shirt, the work shirt with the Harlow Security Services patch on the chest. Then his gaze dropped to Echo, who had materialized at his left flank like a shadow that had learned to breathe, and something shifted in Tyler's expression. Not quite fear. Something earlier than fear. He released his grip. Caitlin dropped 2 inches and gasped. and the sound of that single breath, raw and desperate and relieved all at once, was the loudest thing in the hallway. Nathan was beside her in 3 steps. He caught her before her knees, gave out completely, one hand on her shoulder, one hand on her face, his eyes running over her the way they'd once run over extraction maps, looking for what was wrong and how bad, and what came next. Her throat was already showing the red lines that would be bruises by morning. Her eyes, when they found his, were wet and wide, and younger than 14 had any right to look. "Daddy," she whispered. Nathan said, "Don't apologize. Breathe." He said it quietly, steadily, the same voice he'd used in places she'd never know about, in moments he didn't speak about, when the only thing that mattered was the next breath, and then the one after that. Then a voice came from behind him. Tyler Grantham had never once in his life been in a room where the attention wasn't eventually going to come back to him. "Hey." Tyler's voice had that particular quality of performed boredom that teenage boys practice in bathroom mirrors. "We weren't done." Nathan turned. He turned slowly, one hand still resting on Caitlin's shoulder, and he looked at Tyler Grantham, the way a man looks at a very small, very loud problem that is about to understand exactly how small it is. Echo had already repositioned. He stood between Nathan and the boy, perfectly still, not growling, just present 105 pounds of trained patience coiled around a single, unwavering question. Tyler took one step back without meaning to. "What did you say?" Nathan asked. The hallway had gone completely quiet. 30 phones were still raised, but no one was laughing anymore. Somewhere near the exit, a girl in a pink hoodie began to cry silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. She was a freshman. Her name was Lily Monroe. Tyler Grantham had done this to her brother 8 months ago, and no one had come for them. They drove home in silence for the first 4 minutes. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, the silence of people who have too much, and don't yet know which piece to pick up first. Echo rode in the back, with his head resting on Caitlin's thigh, his eyes half open, his breathing slow and deliberate in the way it always became, when he sensed that what a person needed wasn't action, but presence. Caitlin stared out the passenger window at the flat Ohio streets, at the auto parts store and the dry cleaner and the Methodist church with the marquee that still said Spring Revival AR-12, even though it was the 2nd week of May. Nathan drove with both hands on the wheel, and his eyes moving between the road and the rearview mirror, and his daughter's reflection in the glass, taking inventory the way he couldn't stop himself from doing cataloguing damage, calculating what was seen and what wasn't. Her throat, the way she was holding her jaw slightly forward, the way people do when swallowing hurts. The fact that she hadn't cried yet. That last one worried him most. Nathan broke the silence. How long Caitlin's reflection blinked. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "September," she said. The word landed in the truck cab, like a stone dropped in still water. Nathan did the math without wanting to. September was 8 months ago. 8 months of mornings he'd dropped her off at the curb and watched her walk through those front doors and driven away thinking she was fine. 8 months of evenings at the kitchen table when she'd said times. It was okay. Times and times. Nothing much times and times. Just tired times. And he had accepted every single one of those answers because he was tired too. And because she had always been stronger than she had any right to be, and because he had confused her silence with safety. He pulled the truck to the curb on Mercer Street and cut the engine. He turned to face her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Caitlin finally looked at him. Her eyes were dry and exhausted in a way that was worse than tears. "Because I knew what you'd do," she said. "I knew you'd go up there, and his dad would get involved, and you'd lose the Harlow County contract, and we're already barely." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "You were trying to protect me," Nathan said. "It wasn't a question. I thought I could just get through it," she said. I thought if I kept my head down long enough, hey. He reached over and put his hand over hers on her knee. She had her mother's hands, same long fingers, same habit of curling them inward when she was stressed. He'd noticed that for the first time when she was about 6 years old, and hadn't stopped noticing it since. Listen to me. There is nothing, no job, no contract, no amount of money that matters more than what just happened to you. Do you understand that? She nodded, small and uncertain, like a person who wants very badly to believe something but has spent 8 months learning not to. That night, after Caitlin was asleep, he checked 3 times, standing in her doorway with the hallway light on, watching the rise and fall of her shoulders. Nathan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. Echo lay across his feet. The apartment was quiet in the particular way. Apartments are quiet after something has shifted inside them permanently. On the table in front of him, his phone with 17 missed calls from an unknown number that had started at 6:04 p.m. He hadn't answered. He'd let them roll. What he had done in the 2 hours since they'd gotten home was document everything. He'd photographed Caitlin's throat every 15 minutes, time-stamped, labeled, saved to a folder he'd encrypted and backed up to 2 separate drives. He'd had her write down every incident she could remember, dates, times, locations, witnesses, what was said, what was done, who saw it, and looked away. He'd recorded a video statement of her speaking in her own voice, in her own words, before memory could soften any of it. He'd done this the way he did, everything that mattered, methodically without drama, because he had learned a long time ago that emotion was a compass and preparation was a map, and you needed both, and they weren't the same thing. Then, at 9:48 p.m., he went to Caitlin's room one more time. She was still asleep. Echo had somehow gotten himself off Nathan's feet and into the hallway outside her door, where he lay stretched across the threshold like a living lock. Nathan stood there for a moment, looking at the dog, looking at his daughter's dark room beyond. He thought about his wife, Jennifer, who had grown up 12 minutes from this apartment, who had loved this town with a specific and stubborn loyalty that Nathan had never entirely understood and had come to love about her anyway, who had made him promise in the spring 3 years after Caitlin was born, when the diagnosis was still new enough that they could talk about it without the conversation collapsing, that he would always be there. Asterisk. Not just around times, she'd said. Asterisk. There. Asterisk. He picked up his phone from the table, opened his contacts, scrolled to a name he hadn't called in 14 months. Dex Hollins. Former SEAL Team 5. Currently somewhere in Columbus, doing consulting work that he described when asked as security adjacent. Nathan typed, "Times I need you. Bring your kit. Come tonight if you can. Asterisk." Then he opened his laptop and pulled up an old news article he'd saved to his reading list 6 months ago without quite knowing why. Asterisk, investigative reporter, exposes contractor fraud in 3 Ohio counties. Asterisk, byline Marcus Webb, Columbus Courier-Journal. Nathan read the article twice. Then he picked up his phone again and started making calls. Dean Grantham arrived at 3:47 the following afternoon. Nathan had been expecting him since roughly 8 a.m., which was when the missed calls had switched from the unknown number to a number he could trace to the executive offices of Grantham Development on Harlow's downtown square. He'd let those roll too. Dean came alone, which Nathan noted and filed. A man who brings his lawyers to an opening conversation is a man who believes in legal force. A man who comes alone to your door believes in personal intimidation, which means he's already decided you can be intimidated. Nathan had the door open before Dean reached the landing. Echo was at his heel. Dean Grantham was 53 years old, silver-haired, dressed in the particular way of men who spend money so that other people will think of them as reasonable. He smiled like they were neighbors settling a fence dispute. "Mr. Reeves, I think we should talk man to man." "We can talk here," Nathan said. He didn't step back from the doorway. Dean's eyes moved to Echo, who had not moved or made a sound. He was simply there, solid and watchful, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that made men like Dean Grantham, men who had spent decades calculating the exact social pressure required to make other people step aside, feel obscurely that the math wasn't working the way it was supposed to. Dean's smile stayed in place. "I've done some research. Since yesterday," he said, pulling a manila envelope from inside his jacket and holding it in a way designed to look casual. "I know about your service record. 3 deployments. You've had a hard road since you got back. The job instability, the financial pressures. I understand that. I have a great deal of respect for what you gave this country." He extended the envelope. 45,000, more than a year of your current salary. Use it for Caitlin's college fund, for a better apartment, for whatever your family needs. All I'm asking is that we put this behind us." Nathan looked at the envelope. He let himself look at it long enough to be honest. Because $45,000 was real, and the broken heater in the second bedroom was real, and the fact that Caitlin's winter coat had a zipper that had been broken since January was real, and pretending none of that was true would have been a different kind of lie. Then he thought about the incident list Caitlin had written out at this same kitchen table the night before. 14 incidents over 8 months. He thought about Lily Monroe crying silently in the hallway with her hand over her mouth. "No," Nathan said. Something moved behind Dean's eyes, the first actual thing that had moved there since he arrived. "Mr. Reeves, your son put his hand around my daughter's throat until she couldn't breathe," Nathan said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been when he said no. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's not a family dispute. That's a crime. And I'm going to treat it like one." Dean's pleasant expression finally came apart at the edges. "You have no idea what you're starting." "I know exactly what I'm starting," Nathan said. "I'm starting a fight, and I don't lose fights that matter." That evening, Dex Hollins arrived in a dark blue Ford Transit and carried 2 hard cases up the stairs without being asked what was in them. He set them on the kitchen table and opened the first one, recording equipment, small enough to fit under a thumbnail, military grade, capable of capturing everything within 30 feet with crystalline clarity. Legal in Ohio for personal safety documentation. Nathan had already confirmed that with Patricia Okafor, who had called him back within 4 hours of his initial voicemail and had said, in a voice that carried the particular flat gravity of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific phone call, "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning. Leave nothing out." Patricia was 51 years old, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, currently in private practice in Columbus. She had spent 20 years doing the work that put people like Dean Grantham in federal courtrooms, and she had once 10 years ago been forced to drop a case connected to Grantham development because a key witness had relocated suddenly, completely, and the memory of that had not gotten easier with time. Caitlin had come out of her room while Dex was setting up the equipment and stood in the kitchen doorway watching. Dex looked at her at the bruising on her throat that had deepened overnight to a dark reddish purple, at the way she was standing with her weight slightly back, the posture of someone who had learned to make herself smaller. And then he looked at Nathan, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "You the one who sent the text?" Dex asked her. "Yeah," Caitlin said. Smart Dex said simply. Echo crossed the kitchen and sat down next to Caitlin, pressing his flank gently against her leg. She reached down and put her hand on his back, without looking at him the way you do, with something you trust completely. The video went live at 1:143 p.m. on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it had 20,000 views, and by Friday afternoon it had been picked up by 3 local news aggregators under the headline Times Harlow Father Brings Military Dog to Threaten Student at Maplewood High. Asterisk. Nathan watched it at the kitchen table while his coffee got cold. The footage was clean and deliberately edited. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing, had understood that a story needed a villain and had constructed one carefully. What the video showed, Nathan walking through a crowded school hallway with purpose and a large German shepherd at his heel. Echo's low posture, the combat-ready stillness that any trained animal handler would have recognized as de-escalation positioning, had been reframed through tight angles and slow-motion replays as aggression. Tyler Grantham backing against the lockers with his hand slightly raised. The caption read, "Times Dad Brings Military Attack Dog to School to Intimidate Student. Is anyone safe at Maplewood Times?" What the video did not show, the 30 seconds before Nathan entered the frame. The comments ran to 300 and climbing. Nathan read exactly 4 of them, then closed the tab. He was not a man who was destroyed by other people's opinions of him. He had operated in environments where the consequences of failure were permanent and the opinion of strangers was entirely irrelevant, and that had rearranged his relationship to reputation in ways that people who hadn't experienced it sometimes found difficult to understand. What he understood watching the view counter increment in the corner of his screen was that this was the opening of an information campaign, not a spontaneous reaction, and that information campaigns were planned in advance by people who expected them to be necessary, which meant Dean Grantham had anticipated legal action before Nathan had even made his first call to Patricia Okafor. He was ahead of them on one axis. Nathan intended to make sure that was the only axis. That same afternoon, he was doing a walkthrough of the exterior camera grid at the Harlow County Courthouse routine maintenance, third Thursday of every month, when something about the server room schematics made him stop. He'd serviced this system for 2 years. He knew its architecture the way he knew his own truck's engine. The backup server was contracted to Grantham Development's commercial technology subsidiary, Grantham Systems LLC. He'd filed that away as a routine procurement detail when he'd first taken the contract. Standing in the dim corridor outside the server room, he filed it away differently now. That evening, Caitlin came home from school, quieter than usual. Her locker had been spray-painted with a single red word. Her lunch had been destroyed. She'd called Nathan from the girls' bathroom, and he'd talked to her for 20 minutes from the front seat of his truck in the courthouse parking lot. His voice steady and unhurried, describing brick by brick what they were building together, while Echo sat in the back seat with his chin on the headrest and listened with the focused attention of a creature who understood that the sound of Nathan's voice mattered more than the content of his words. What Nathan did not yet know, 3 photographs arrived in his mailbox that evening, slipped inside a plain white envelope with no return address. Caitlin walking to school. Caitlin at her locker. Caitlin sitting alone in the cafeteria. All taken from distance with a telephoto lens. At the bottom, a typed note on plain white paper. "We're watching. Stop now." Nathan looked at the photographs for a long time. He photographed the envelope, the note, and each of the 3 photographs separately on a flat white surface with a ruler for scale, time-stamped, and emailed them to Patricia Okafor with the subject line, "Threat documentation received this evening." Patricia replied in 4 minutes, "I'm forwarding this to Castillo tonight. Keep the originals in a sealed bag. Don't touch them again." Then he called Dex and said, "They're running surveillance on my daughter." And Dex said, "Counter-surveillance starts tomorrow. I want to know who they hired." And Nathan said, "So do I." Then he did something he hadn't done since he was a younger man, on a different kind of mission. He opened his laptop and started building a target folder. Not on Tyler, not on Dean, on the system. Because that was the thing about men like Dean Grantham, they didn't operate alone. They operated inside structures they'd spent years constructing, and the structures were the real target. The next morning, Nathan showed Caitlin the TikTok video on his phone. She watched it without expression, then watched it again. Then she took out her own phone, opened the camera, and pressed record. "Echo," she said. Nathan unmuted the video and let it play for 3 seconds, just long enough for Tyler's voice to come through the phone speaker, that particular flat, careless voice. Echo looked at the phone on the table, and his ears went up, and his lips parted almost imperceptibly. Nathan muted it again. The dog's eyes stayed on the phone for another 4 seconds before he looked away. Caitlin filmed it for 11 seconds. She posted it that night with the caption times, "My dad's dog recognizes the bully from a video on a phone screen. He was there. He knows what happened." Asterisk. By morning, it had 500,000 views. The comment ratio had inverted. It happened on a Wednesday, between 5th and 6th period. Caitlin had gym 5th period. The locker rooms let out into a short corridor behind the main athletic building, and there was a 40-second window. Nathan had not known this, but Tyler had known it since October, had timed it on 3 separate Tuesdays before he used it, between when the girls exited and when the next class arrived, when the corridor was briefly completely empty. The camera footage Nadia had recovered showed him walking that corridor alone on each of those Tuesdays, looking up at the camera position, checking his watch. Caitlin never made it to 6th period. The school nurse called Nathan at 1:25 p.m. The voice on the other end was shaking in a specific way, not with grief, but with the particular controlled panic of someone who had seen something they could not unsee, and was now recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the building they worked in. "Mr. Reeves, there's been an incident. Caitlin is unconscious. The paramedics are already on their way." He made the drive in 8 minutes. He found her in room 7 of Harlow County General, with an IV in her left arm and a bandage above her right eye, and her left cheekbone swollen with the distinctive circular impression of a signet ring, a championship ring, Tyler Grantham's. Her right hand was in a small sealed evidence bag on the bedside cart. The nurse who met Nathan at the door told him, very quietly and very deliberately, that Caitlin had scratched her attacker's face with her right hand before she lost consciousness, and that the evidence collection kit had already been sent to the lab. Nathan sat down in the plastic chair beside her bed and took her left hand in both of his and held it without speaking. He didn't trust his voice. Caitlin opened her eyes at 2:14 p.m. The first thing she said was, "I remembered what you said about not giving up." He pressed his forehead to her hand. She said, "I got him right." "Yeah," Nathan said. "You got him." She said, "I don't feel strong. I feel broken." He lifted his head and looked at her. Her good eye was bloodshot. Her face was swollen and bruised, and there was tape over her eyebrow, and she looked about 9 years old, and also, underneath all of it, like something that did not intend to be finished. "You're not broken," he said. "You're battered. Those aren't the same thing. Broken people stop. You just told me the first thing out of your mouth was that you got him. That's not broken. That's something else." Detective Renee Castillo arrived at 3:30 p.m. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, unhurried in her movements, with the specific kind of tired in her eyes that comes not from exhaustion, but from having spent years watching the powerful protect themselves at the expense of everyone. Elsa. Nathan had asked Dex to look into the Harlow Police Department's personnel file 3 days earlier, and Dex had come back with one name underlined: Castillo. 20 years on the force, 2 commendations, currently running an internal investigation into Harlow's own chief of police, Webb Carver, for financial impropriety. She sat beside the bed and spoke to Caitlin gently, and wrote down everything Caitlin told her, without interrupting or qualifying or suggesting that any of it might be complicated. When Caitlin finished, Castillo looked at Nathan and said, "Tell me what you have." At 9 p.m., after Caitlin had fallen asleep again, Nathan stood in the hospital parking garage and called Dex. "It's time," he said. "Full operation." There was a pause. "Who else do we need?" "Nadia Torres," Nathan said. "I need her in Harlow by Friday." There was another pause, shorter this time. "She'll be there," Dex said. Nadia Torres arrived on a Thursday evening in a rental Civic with 3 laptops in a canvas bag and the kind of focused, purposeful quiet that Nathan recognized from people who were very good at the specific thing they were trained to do. That Nathan recognized from people who were very good at the specific thing they were trained to do. Former Navy IT Specialist SEAL Support Team. 2 deployments, currently freelance, in a way that various government and private entities found useful. She sat up at the kitchen table while Nathan made coffee, and Echo inspected her equipment bag with professional thoroughness, and then lay down under the table, apparently satisfied. Nadia explained the situation in 12 minutes. The school's security camera footage was stored on a cloud-based server managed by a vendor called Grantham Systems LLC, under a contract with Harlow County Public Schools. A contract awarded 3 years ago through a procurement process that Detective Castillo had flagged as irregularly structured. The footage was routinely purged every 90 days according to the vendor's published policy. What Nadia had found, however, working through the night on Thursday with Echo at her feet and the apartment quiet around them, was that the purge process had been interrupted 17 separate times over the past 3 years. Not by accident. The footage wasn't gone. It was staged as gone. Nathan leaned over her shoulder and looked at the recovered file directories. The timestamps went back to September of the previous year. He recognized the camera angles immediately. He'd helped service 3 of those cameras as part of a school security contract upgrade 16 months ago. He knew exactly what each angle covered. He said, "Open the ones from the east corridor." Nadia opened them. He watched in silence for 4 minutes. Tyler Grantham was on every relevant file. He was methodical. Nathan noticed the way a predator is methodical, which is to say, without thought, instinctively targeting the moments of structural vulnerability. That a school building created the 3-minute gap after gym, the blind corner past the library auxiliary entrance, the north bathroom corridor on Fridays when the security monitor went to lunch early. There was footage of Principal Kessel's office window. In 3 separate incidents, her vertical blinds were open. In 2 of them, a human shadow was clearly visible inside. In both of those, within 8 minutes of the incident occurring, the camera in that corridor had experienced what the system log described as a scheduled maintenance interruption. "Pull Kessel's call records," Nathan said. Nadia said, "Already requested through Castillo. Should have them by Monday. Pull the Grantham Systems server logs too. All 3 years. That's going to require a subpoena. Patricia's filing for it, Monday morning." Nadia nodded and typed. Under the table, Echo shifted his position and resettled against her feet. She'd been working for 6 hours. She glanced down at the dog briefly, then back at her screen. There was something that might have been gratitude in her expression, the acknowledgement of a kind of company that doesn't ask for anything. At 2:17 a.m., Nadia said quietly, and without drama, "Got it." Nathan was at her shoulder in 3 steps. The recovered file was a metadata index, not the emails themselves, but the structural record of their existence. Sender IDs, recipient IDs, timestamps, file sizes, and a single unencrypted subject line from a thread in October 2016 that read, "Re-Holt, Final Resolution." Nadia sat back and said, I can't open these without a warrant, but I can show Patricia exactly where they are and what the index says. Nathan said, "That's enough. That's exactly enough." Leonard Holt had died in a single-car accident on Route 33 inches, October 2016. The accident investigation had been handled by the Harlow County Sheriff's Office. The lead investigator had been a deputy named Webb Carver, who was now chief of police. Nathan stood in his kitchen at 2:17 a.m. and looked at what they had. DNA from Caitlin's fingernails. 3 years of recovered camera footage. A metadata index pointing to financial records. Records that a federal warrant, filed Monday morning, would make accessible, linking Dean Grantham to the systematic corruption of a county law enforcement officer. And now the outline of a murder. Echo got up from under the table and came to stand beside him. Nathan put his hand on the dog's head and didn't say anything. On Monday morning, Caitlin went back to school. She had asked Nathan on Sunday night if she could stay home one more day, and he had sat with her at the kitchen table and told her, honestly and without pretense, exactly what they were doing and why it required her to go back, and she had listened to all of it, with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate and her eyes calm in the way that his wife's eyes used to get calm when she had decided something. "Okay," she said. "I'll go." He fitted the device a recording unit the size of a nickel embedded in the lining of her jacket collar in 4 minutes flat. It was the same class of equipment he installed in courthouse hallways and municipal parking garages for a living. He had called Patricia at 7:15 a.m. to confirm the one-party consent parameters under Ohio law, and Patricia had said that given the documented threat history and the active police investigation, she would notify Mr. Greer this morning, as a courtesy not to ask permission, but to ensure the school's cooperation if the recording became evidence. He did it without ceremony and without making it feel like something frightening, because it wasn't because she was not bait. She was a person who had chosen to exercise a legal right to document her own safety, and the distinction mattered. Echo was waiting at the front door when they went to leave. He sat squarely in the center of the doorway and looked at Nathan with the specific, focused attention that Nathan had come to understand. Over 7 years of living with this animal meant times I'm going. Asterisk. Nathan called the school. He explained the situation to the vice principal, the ongoing investigation, the formal police involvement, the documented threat history. He invoked Caitlin's right to emotional support accommodations under Ohio education law. The vice principal said she would check with the principal. The principal, not Kessel, who was on administrative leave, but a substitute administrator named Mr. Greer, who had arrived on Monday morning with no established loyalties and no financial history with Grantham Development, said yes. They walked into Maplewood High School together at 7:52 a.m. Students noticed. Some stared. Some looked away. Tyler Grantham, across the cafeteria during second period, saw Echo and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling and did not have a name for, which was the early registration of consequences. He found Caitlin in the library during fourth period. He'd waited, she could tell he'd planned. It had spent the weekend convincing himself that nothing had actually changed, that the machinery his father had always operated would continue to function, that the situation was still manageable. He blocked the exit between 2 stacks and leaned against the shelf and looked at her with the expression of someone who believed they were still the most powerful person in the room. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. "Caitlin said I go to school here. My dad's going to fix this," he said. "The people your dad's been talking to, they work for us. They always have." He stepped closer. Echo stood up from beside Caitlin's chair and positioned himself between them, not moving toward Tyler, not growling, just occupying the space. Tyler looked down at the dog and stopped. That 1 second of hesitation, the involuntary physical pause of a body that had received information the brain was still processing, was enough. Caitlin said evenly, "You should probably stop talking." He grabbed her arm anyway. He said things that the recording device in her collar captured with perfect clarity, including a specific reference to times the deal my dad made with Judge Perkins back in February. Asterisk. He said it casually, the way people mention things they consider settled, things they don't imagine anyone would ever be in a position to use against them. He let go when a teacher appeared at the end of the aisle. He walked away. In the surveillance van 2 blocks from the school, Dex Hollins took his headphones off and set them on the console and said, very quietly, "Got him." That evening, Nathan called FBI Special Agent Brian Solis at the Columbus field office. Patricia Okafor had made the introduction 3 days earlier. Solis had been waiting for this call. Judicial bribery was a federal offense. The involvement of a sitting county judge elevated the case beyond anything local law enforcement. Even Castillo had jurisdictional authority to prosecute alone. "How soon can you move?" Nathan asked. Solis was quiet for a moment. "Patricia's been feeding us material for 11 days. We've had a parallel investigation running since she made contact. What you just gave me closes the last gap. 3 weeks, maybe less, to get the warrant package in front of a federal judge we trust. We move when it's airtight, not before." The warrants were executed simultaneously at 6:00 p.m. on a Thursday 19 days after Nathan's call to Solis. Nathan was not there for any of it. He had been asked by Detective Castillo and by Agent Solis independently whether he wanted to be present for the arrests, and he had said no both times. For the same reason, both times this was not about him. It was about the 14 families who had filed complaints that had been buried. The 6 kids whose medical records showed injuries that had been documented and ignored. The 1 man who had been killed on a county road 8 years ago and whose death had been signed off on by a corrupt officer who was now being removed from his position in handcuffs. Nathan watched it on the television in his apartment, the way any citizen watches the news. Tyler Grantham was arrested during lacrosse practice. The footage showed him in full gear on the turf field, 2 officers approaching from the sideline, the coach stepping back with his hands up and away from the situation, in the instinctive gesture of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is different than he thought. Tyler said things to the arresting officers that were broadcast briefly and then cut from subsequent coverage. He invoked his father's name 7 times. Dean Grantham was arrested in the executive conference room of Grantham Development on the downtown square, mid-meeting, in front of 4 members of his board. The federal charges were read aloud in that room, and Nathan, watching the footage an hour later, found that the part that stayed with him was not Dean's face when the handcuffs went on, but the faces of the 4 board members, who had known Dean Grantham for decades, and were now sitting very still at a conference table, performing a rapid recalculation of everything they had believed to be true. Chief Carver resigned by 7 p.m. Principal Kessel was placed under arrest at her home at 7:23 p.m. Judge Perkins submitted his resignation letter to the Ohio Supreme Court at 8:11 p.m. The FBI arrived at his house with a warrant at 8:14 p.m. He had answered the door already wearing his coat. Agent Solis noted in his report that Perkins had made 11 phone calls in the 90 minutes preceding the warrant execution calls that would form a separate thread of the obstruction case. Marcus Webb's story went live at 9 p.m. on the Columbus Courier-Journal website. Within 40 minutes, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By 10 p.m., it had been shared by the governor's press office. By midnight, the story was national. Nathan sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and watched the view counter on his phone climb. Caitlin came out of her room at 10:30 inches, her socks and her old Harlow High sweatshirt that had been her mother's, and she sat down across from him without saying anything. On the television in the living room, they could see Dean Grantham being walked in handcuffs through the lobby of the Grantham Development building, and as the footage played, echo lying in front of the couch, lifted his head and looked at the screen, and then turned and looked at Caitlin and wagged his tail once. Slowly, deliberately, as though he had been keeping track and had reached a conclusion. Caitlin let out a single short laugh. It was the first time Nathan had heard her laugh in 4 months. She took out her phone and filmed it. The caption she posted was 6 words. Times. He knew. He always knew. Echo. Asterisk. By morning, it had 2 million views. The comments were almost uniformly some version of the same thing, times the dog knew. Asterisk. Nathan watched his daughter laugh at her phone and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was held. Later that night, after Caitlin was asleep, he went to the window and stood there in the dark and thought about Jennifer, about the particular quality of her belief in him, not naive, not unconditional in the way that asks nothing, but the specific belief of a person who has seen you at your worst and decided that you are still worth the investment. He hadn't always been sure she was right. He said quietly, to no one, "We did it." Echo padded over from the couch and sat beside him. They stood at the window together in the dark, looking out at Harlow, and Nathan put his hand on the dog's head, and neither of them moved for a long time. The juvenile court proceeding for Tyler Grantham lasted 3 days. The evidence was comprehensive, and the outcome was not in serious doubt. The recovered footage alone, authenticated by 2 independent forensic analysts, whose findings had been requested simultaneously by the prosecution and by Tyler's own defense team, who had apparently hoped to find a flaw and had not made the case something other than a contest. Tyler was sentenced to 4 years in a juvenile rehabilitation facility with mandatory psychological treatment, beginning in the first month. He cried during the sentencing. Not the performance of crying, the actual thing, the involuntary collapse of a person who has spent 17 years inside a structure that just fell down around him. His court-appointed therapist, who had spent 6 weeks with him prior to sentencing, told the court that Tyler Grantham had never in his life been held accountable for any action, and that accountability, experienced for the first time at 17, registered in the nervous system as catastrophic loss. The judge listened to this with the expression of a person absorbing information that is true and also insufficient. She sentenced him anyway. Dean Grantham's federal trial ran 9 weeks. Raymond Fitch testified for the prosecution under a cooperation agreement. He had turned himself in voluntarily, had walked into the Columbus FBI field office on the Thursday morning of the arrests. 3 hours after the warrants had been executed, when it became clear to him that Dean Grantham's infrastructure was no longer capable of protecting anyone. He had identified himself to the agent at the desk and said, with the composure of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally decided that the floor is going to give way regardless, "I need to talk to someone about Leonard Holt. I think you're already looking for me." He said on the stand that he had watched a 14-year-old girl stand up in a school library on a video that 11 million people had seen, and that for the first time in 8 years, he had understood that the structure he had been depending on to stay silent was built on the same rotten ground as everything else Dean Grantham had ever built. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, judicial bribery, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dean Grantham's response when the verdict was read was to stand up and say loudly that he had built this county, that none of them would have anything without him, that they were making a mistake that history would judge harshly. The judge gave him 30 seconds before the bailiff intervened. Nathan was not in the courtroom. He had been there for the first day and part of the second, and then he had made a decision based on an honest assessment of what was useful versus what was ceremonial. and he had spent the remaining days of the trial at work, replacing a corroded access panel at the Harlow Public Library, which was a thing that needed to be done and which he was good at doing. He got the verdict by text from Patricia Okafor, times, all counts, life, he's done. Asterisk. He read it once. He was sitting on a concrete step outside the library, eating a sandwich, and Echo was beside him watching a pigeon with the attentive neutrality of an animal who has learned to be patient. Eleanor Grantham had filed for divorce the morning after Dean's arrest. She reached out to Patricia Okafor's office 6 weeks into the federal trial and asked to meet with the families of Tyler's victims. Nathan brought Caitlin. They met in a conference room at Patricia's office, 9 families in folding chairs. Eleanor Grantham at the front, her hands folded on the table. She didn't offer excuses. She said, "I knew something was wrong with my son from the time he was 12 years old. I asked Dean to get him help. Dean told me that Tyler was fine, that boys were supposed to be aggressive, that it would embarrass the family. I chose my marriage over those children. I will spend the rest of my life understanding what that choice cost." She looked at Caitlin directly when she said the last part. Caitlin looked back at her without expression for a long moment. And then she nodded, a single small nod that was not forgiveness exactly, but was the acknowledgement of something real. Owen Park was at the meeting. He sat in the back row and didn't speak until Eleanor had finished, and then he raised his hand and said in a voice that was still finding its steadiness, "I was there the day Tyler attacked Caitlin the second time. Behind the athletic building, I saw it. I didn't do anything." The room was quiet. Eleanor Grantham looked at him. "I'm sorry," Owen said. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. After the meeting, he and Caitlin stood in the parking lot while the September afternoon cooled around them. Echo was beside her, leaning gently against her leg. Owen reached down and touched the dog's head, and Echo turned his face toward the boy's hand and let him. Owen stood there for a long moment with his hand on Echo's head and didn't say anything, and the dog bore the weight of everything Owen couldn't put into words, with the calm, patient grace that was his particular genius. 3 months after Dean Grantham's sentencing, Nathan took a new job. The Ohio Department of Education had funded a pilot program placing trained therapy dogs in schools with documented histories of student trauma, and the program coordinator, a woman named Dr. Vivienne Marsh, who had spent 20 years in school counseling and had read about Echo in the Courier-Journal profile Marcus Webb, had written in September, called Nathan, and offered him the position of program coordinator for the Pocum, Central Ohio region. It paid less than Harlow Security Services. It offered health insurance for the first time in 4 years. He accepted it on a Tuesday morning. Standing in his kitchen, and after he hung up, he stood there for a moment, in the quiet, and thought about how strange it was that the most important things in your life almost never feel like decisions. When you make them, they feel like recognitions. Echo was now the first certified dog in the program, which meant Nathan brought him to 3 schools a week and spent 2 hours in each building watching the dog do the thing he had apparently always been doing, which was reading people with a precision and a patience that Nathan had started to think was less about training and more about something intrinsic to the animal, a fundamental orientation toward the emotional truth of a room that no amount of schooling had taught him, and no amount of trauma had taken away. On a Thursday in November, Caitlin launched the Echo Project. The name was her idea. She'd explained it to Nathan the week before, sitting across the kitchen table from him with a legal pad full of notes. An in-school peer support organization for students experiencing bullying or abuse, focused on connecting students with adult advocates outside the reporting structures that had failed so many of them at Maplewood. She'd consulted with Dr. Marsh. She'd drafted bylaws. She'd gotten the school's new principal, Mr. Greer, who had turned out to be exactly what he appeared to be, which was a person who cared about children and found the previous administration's history appalling to approve the club's official status. 31 students came to the first meeting. Caitlin stood at the front of the room and said, "My name is Caitlin Reeves. 8 months ago, I was strangled in the hallway of this school and 30 people filmed it instead of helping. I'm not telling you that so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that someone in this room has been exactly where you are and is still here." Owen Park stood beside her. He said I was one of the 30. The room was quiet. "I didn't help," Owen said. "I've spent every day since then thinking about that. I don't want to be that person anymore. That's why I'm here." Toward the end of the meeting, a boy in the third row, small, young looking for his age, wearing a Minecraft t-shirt, 2 sizes too large, raised his hand and started to say something, and then stopped. Caitlin recognized the stopping. She'd done it herself in that bathroom phone call to Nathan in the parking lot in 100 small moments over 8 months. She walked Echo over and sat down cross-legged in front of the boy. Echo lay down, put his head on the boy's knee and looked up at him with the amber-eyed, total, uncomplicated attention that was his gift. The boy looked at the dog for a moment. Then he bent forward slightly and began speaking quietly into Echo's ear. Caitlin sat beside them and did not rush anything. That evening, Nathan received a letter in a plain white envelope postmarked from the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. He recognized the return name before he opened it. He read it at the kitchen table. Asterisk, Mr. Reeves. I don't expect you to read this. I want to say it anyway. I have spent the last 3 months thinking about a specific moment. Not the arrest, not the trial. A video, 11 million views of your dog, recognizing my son's face on a phone screen. I spent 30 years teaching my son that everything could be managed, that the right amount of money or pressure applied to the right point could solve any problem. I believed that completely. I watched a dog look at a phone screen and I understood, for the first time, that there are things in this world that cannot be bought. I taught my son wrong. I have spent 30 years being wrong, in ways that I did not let myself see. I cannot undo what I did. I don't ask for anything. I just needed to say it to someone. Asterisk. He read it twice. Then he called Caitlin in from her room and read it to her. She listened with her chin in her hand, looking at the wall. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Echo, who was lying beside Nathan's chair. "Read it to him," she said. Nathan looked at her. "Read it to Echo," she said. There was nothing ironic in her voice. She was 14 years old, and she was completely serious, and she was. Nathan thought the bravest person he had ever known, including everyone he'd served with, including himself. He looked down at the dog. Echo looked back at him with those amber eyes that had watched so much and asked for so little. Nathan cleared his throat and began reading the letter again quietly to the dog. In December, on the anniversary of Jennifer's death, Nathan and Caitlin drove to Harlow Memorial and stood together in front of her headstone. Echo sat between them, pressed lightly against Caitlin's leg. The grass was winter dry, and the sky was that particular shade of Ohio December gray that looks like it has been there forever and intends to stay. Caitlin knelt and traced her mother's name with her fingertips. She said, "Hi, Mom. We're okay. We're actually okay." She was quiet for a moment. Dad kept his promise. You knew he would. Nathan put his hand on the stone. He didn't say anything out loud. He thought times. She's safe. I kept my word. Asterisk. He thought times. Thank you for choosing this town. Thank you for leaving him with us. Asterisk. Echo, unprompted, lay down against the base of the headstone and rested his chin on his paws, and looked out across the winter cemetery with the calm, unhurried attention of a creature who understood in whatever way animals understand the things they know, that this was a place that mattered and that the right thing to do was stay. If this story moved, you hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which moment hit hardest and where in the world you are watching from.